I think the vote might be split on The Country Bears. A lot of people assume that it's terrible. A lot of people saw it as kids and have fond memories of it. I'm not here to settle that debate. There are plenty of other videos on this very website where people rant about or rediscover The Country Bears. In this video, I'm going to talk about some of the interesting themes and ideas that bubble through this movie. First, we'll talk about the vestiges of Christianity in the film and the way that the movie encounters the American middle class, the white American middle class. There are some interesting racial undertones in the movie. We'll talk about those. We'll talk about the music scene and how the movie tries to be edgy while still being a kid's movie. And then I guess we'll talk about nostalgia, how the movie is backwards looking, and maybe why bands can make us so nostalgic in the first place. Some of this stuff might seem a little overblown, I guess. I'm not going to read too deeply into this movie, but I find that kids' movies often have a lot of conspicuous things in them. Sometimes more stuff jumps out at you from a movie like The Country Bears than from one that wins Best Picture. It's a shame that The Country Bears didn't win Best Picture. Well, I don't know. Before we really get into it, I will briefly reveal my personal opinion, which is that this is an okay movie. It has a few scenes which are basically unwatchable, but it more or less keeps its dignity. I think you have to be on board with the whole thing being ridiculous, absurd from the beginning, or you're not going to get very far at all. I found the movie to be funny. Of course, it's a kid's movie, but there's a lot of little things going on. There's some nice details to look at. For instance, Barry has a poster for Limp Bizkit and Nine Inch Nails in his room. I think the Country Bears' influence on those two groups is unmistakable. Like I said, you have to kind of be on board with the absurdism from the beginning. But if so, hey, it's fun. Dramatically, this movie is not gripping. It has a few enormous plot holes, but I had a decent time watching it. Just mute a couple of scenes or fast forward through them and you should be good to go. The soundtrack for the film is also surprisingly decent. I actually bought a CD of it from eBay after watching the movie. I was hoping it would be here for this video, but it isn't, so I'll show you the most recent CD, which I have purchased, which is the Crusaders' Rural Renewal. Did you know that the Crusaders have an album featuring Eric Clapton? If you look at the cast of this movie, make sure you scroll all the way down to see some of the people who provide the singing voices for the Bears. The Bears don't actually do their own singing in this movie. Bonnie Raitt is one of them. Don Henley is another. He also has a cameo as the guy at the bar who says that the Country Bears are better than the Eagles. Let me know in the comments, do you agree? Christopher Walken is probably the one standout in the cast. His role is basically self-parody, but it's still kind of fun to watch Christopher Walken doing himself, you know? Last thing here in the opinion section is that I'm glad this movie came out when it did and isn't like 10 years newer or didn't come out now. Although there is rumors of a sequel, but we'll see. I think if this movie came out today, the Bears would have been digitally rendered. And I think the bear suits are great in this movie. A little bit hokey here and there, but it gives some really nice interactions between the actors and the animals that would be tricky to pull off even today. Anyway, let's get to the interesting stuff. There isn't any explicit religion in this film, but Barry talks a few times about his higher calling. What's that? Well, this idea is introduced by his dad at the dinner table. Barry is sitting there holding hands with his mom and his dad, holding hands and paws. Anyway, this is secular stuff, but it feels a bit religious. Sitting around the dinner table, hands clasped, almost, it's like if you said grace. Not that I really know how that works, but I think it looks a bit like this. A higher calling, that's a pretty vague idea unless you're talking about God, in which case, still a pretty vague idea. Maybe this is just some lazy kids movie writing. Maybe it's a deliberate attempt to nod to a certain demographic. Is the Country Bears aimed a little bit more at Southern audiences? Interesting question. Does the Country Bear Hall look somewhat like a church? I think that's a bit of a stretch. I think that's going too far. If this movie is somewhat pious, how is that going to square with the irreverent lifestyle of the Country Bears? I think that actually hints at one of the defining tensions of this movie, this sort of edginess, but also mainstreamness of the film. And that's, whether or not you believe me about this religious stuff, I could be on a fishing expedition here, but that tension is kind of inarguable, and I'll talk a lot about it more. Barry's family is another example, really. They kind of lead a double life. I mentioned, they have this wholesome dinner table thing, talking about, finding your calling. This movie, of course, also preaches about the meaning and the importance of family. The people who will always love you, that's your family, says Barry's dad. It says Disney. So this is wholesome stuff. Sounds great. Sign me up, right? But on the other hand, Barry's dad is named Norbert. And Norbert is one of the deadliest dads in all of cinema. What I'm getting at here is that this film, yes, very wholesome, but there's also some satirical thing going on there. It's also poking fun at this suburban family. The mother is always baking stuff. There's a great scene, one of my favorite moments in the movie, where they try to fit everyone into the family minivan, but they can't fit the bear. What are they going to do? Well, they try and juggle things all different. Oh, pack in the van, right? That's suburban life, right? Trying to fit things into a minivan. Well, how do they solve the problem? The dad attaches the boat to the back of the car and tows it behind. Put the bear in the boat. Brilliant. I mean, this is like peak suburb, Americana. Beautiful scene, right? Great stuff. The Country Bears came out in 2002. This was a time when Hollywood kind of had its sights set on the American suburb. Now, this is no American Beauty, but, you know, I think these moments, these examples I just gave, they're lighthearted, right? Let's not get carried away. They're lighthearted. But there's a little bit of zing there. There's something going on. We're poking at something. Like I said, Norbert is leading a double life. Barry's family is wholesome, but it's also this suburban send-up. These things don't really contradict, but there is some tension there. This is really fairly common, though, I think. To me, one of the hallmarks of a mainstream film is that it reaffirms mainstream culture, even if it teases out some foibles, even if it makes fun of some people, pokes fun at some institution. At the end of the day, the mainstream values are retrenched. The suburb's a great place to live. Go move there, live happily ever after with your brother who happens to be a bear, right? We see this kind of thing all over the place in The Country Bears. Okay, one of the worst scenes in this movie comes when one of the former bears, who's now working as a security guard, fortunately still carries his harmonica around with him, he's invited by a pop star to rehearse one of her songs. This pop star, Crystal, seems to come straight out of the Disney cliche book. I guess some executive said, hey, we need to get more girls to watch this movie. Let's put Hannah Montana in it. The Country Bears predates Hannah Montana, of course, but it seems a similar idea to me. I'm not really an expert here, but I'm always a little fascinated by fake bands or fake pop stars in movies. If you can make a fake pop star, can't you make a real one? Well, Hannah Montana actually is exactly that. It turns out that maybe those things aren't that different. If you can make a TV show about a pop star, can't you make a real one? In this movie, by the way, we have Crystal Harris, a real person. She had a song in The Princess Diaries, another Disney film. It's interesting. Disney often orchestrates this double stardom thing. Food for thought. The Country Bears don't really get to participate in this. Well, I mean, it did start as a theme park ride, but there isn't really any real-world equivalent to, like, this didn't spawn the career of the Country Bears as real life, as a real band, as far as I know. Anyway, Crystal recognizes the security guard and invites him to rehearse one of her songs, although this rehearsal ends up being more like a music video. Okay, another interesting thing you could look at in this movie is how it treats sort of the reality principle. Like, is this a musical is kind of the question, right? So sometimes in musicals, you are allowed to be you're allowed to play very fast and loose with the rules of the world. People start singing a song, no worries to just transport them at 2,000 miles and have them be singing the rest of the song somewhere else and then come back or something like that. Travel back in time during the song, all this stuff. No problemo, right? In the Country Bears, some of the stuff is set up more like, this is a live concert that we're filming. It's a concert film or something. Or, a lot of it looks like VH1 in some way. So there's some tropes they're playing at there, which are more in the realist angle, which is great stuff because a lot of the comedy in the film comes from playing this reality principle, this, oh, look, it's a real band. Oh, look, it's VH1 against, wait, they're bears, right? Okay, but at the same time, this number with Crystal kind of breaks this reality in some ways. And I think there's two scenes where this really clearly happens, where we're not just sort of watching a real performance in the film, but instead the film goes sort of into this like musical territory and kind of abandons the reality of the film. And one of these is with Crystal, and the first time. The other one is later with another girl, I forget her name, but they go to this restaurant. And you could argue that this is still part of the real world, but nah. I've never been to a restaurant like that. Anyway, it's interesting that these both fall in sort of the Disney pop star thing. Yeah. Anyway, this is all supposed to be a bit of a sidebar. This, thing with Crystal, it's like, oh, come rehearse with us. But then it's like the movie turns into a music video that the bear is in. So again, abandoning the reality of the film, doing something totally different. Interesting. Maybe this is all connected into, like I said, this marketing idea of churning out these pop stars and things like that, the music videoification of film with Disney at the center of it, all this stuff. Okay, whatever. I'm trying to get to another point here. Anyway, this music video, like I said, it's one of the worst scenes in the movie. This whole thing, I mean, yeah, terrible. There is a decent sight gag where you see Fred's harmonica. Crystal picks up Fred's harmonica, and you realize, whoa, it's really big. The bears are big. They do a pretty good job of like handling the scale of the bears in this movie. The bears don't seem enormous, but there are a couple interactions. Like Barry hugs his mom, and you're like, wait a minute, this cute little kid bear is like as big as his mother. Well, his mother. I think they do a good job of scale in this movie. Okay, again, getting sidetracked. The point I'm trying to get to here is that the music in this rehearsal kicks off with a harmonica riff. Fred played the harmonica riff, and then Crystal played the tambourine or something like that. But then when the band comes in, are they playing country music? No, they're playing some kind of funk music, and the band, it turns out, is mostly black, right? There is funk harmonica, by the way. It's a real thing. Lee Oskar, probably the most famous example of that. If you've heard the song Lowrider by War, you've heard him play. Anyway, I think the terms black music and white music are a little bit weird, but it's hard to argue that some pattern of influence or even exploitation has run through almost the entire history of American popular music. The genesis of rock and roll is perhaps thievery, right? Who knows? Who knows? I'm not going to make any bold claims here. I'm not really an expert. But I think of the early 2000s really as a period where there was a lot of repackaging going on. I watched a few minutes of Justin Timberlake's Tiny Desk concert the other day. I avoided Justin Timberlake like the plague when I was growing up because, of course, I tried to avoid all popular anything. But I watched a few minutes of his Tiny Desk concert, and I thought, wait a second, isn't this just R&B music? It musically reminded me tons and tons of, things you would hear even in a church, for instance, right? R&B music that has been retrofitted with a marketable mainstream pop idol, white pop idol. Apparently, by the way, Justin Timberlake got a start on the new Mickey Mouse Club show thing, something like that. Disney, right? Okay, I'm not trying to make any bold claims here, but it's interesting. This scene with Crystal is pretty conspicuous, and it's just one of a number of moments where race comes into play where you might not totally expect it. During the credits at the end of the movie, we get some great interviews with contemporary music stars. They've got Willie Nelson, Brian Setzer, and, well, okay, I don't know if Willie Nelson is a contemporary star exactly, but, you get the idea. They also have Queen Latifah and Exhibit, right? A few other, like, rappers, I think, that I don't remember. Queen Latifah says that the Country Bears helped her to feel more comfortable as a larger woman, or something like that. Exhibit talks about how the Country Bears inspired him, allowed him to, like, speak his truth and things like that. I think this is one of the best parts of the movie. The credits, right, are, I think, absolutely hilarious. Like, just totally absurd. I don't think they would do this today. So, yeah, again, look, lighthearted stuff, but it still hints at something that's going on in this movie where the Bears are kind of passing as black, right? Interesting. Okay, let me say, first of all, that the first part with Crystal, I think it may be a little bit disconnected from that. That just seems like a classic example of repackaging a certain type of music for Disney or something like that. A pretty, I don't know, kind of interesting. But I'm talking about something a little bit different here. The Bears passing as black, right? For instance, in the beginning, there is this great joke. I mean, this is probably the most famous joke in the movie, where Barry comes down to the dinner and he says, "Am I adopted?" The family, no, they say. They're always dancing around him being a bear. When they describe him, they say, "Oh, well, he's this tall, he's got this feature, all this stuff." The cops ask, "Any distinguishing features?" And like, no. They're like, "How do you spell his name? Is it Berry? No, Beary. Like the German spelling, not, like the animal, right?" So they're always dancing around the fact that he's a bear. But maybe he senses in some way that he might not belong. I guess his brother tells him, "Hey, look, you don't belong." Anyway, this bears as outsiders thing, it seems kind of racial to me. They are black bears, after all. Okay, that part's not relevant. Even if you don't buy the fact that maybe there's some racial element here, it's pretty clear that the Bears are supposed to be these edgy outsiders. Part of their charm is that they do things their own way. They're countercultural figures common in the music scene, right? There is some connection. I mean, music for many people is not just sound, right? There's a lot more going on in terms of which band you like and pay attention to and things like that. And part of it might be, musicians representing some sort of countercultural force or something like that. Anyway, how does this edginess, how does this otherness, how does it square with a kid's movie, right? I think, by the way, that's one of the points that some people might make about why, like, mainstream white pop music so often, like, borrows or steals from like less mainstream music is because people crave some sort of otherness in keeping the popular thing going on. Like you need some kind of edge. You got to get it from somewhere. Got to get it from some foreign thing or whatever. So you go hunt down, something less mainstream or whatever and co-opt it, right? In this case, they're bears. Anyway, point is, how does this sort of pursuit of edginess or something like that, how does it square with a kid's movie, right? Same idea, mainstream co-option of cool stuff. I've mentioned this in another video, but there's an episode of The Simpsons where Krusty the Clown gets some notes from a network executive, and the exec says, she says, all we're saying is be dangerous but warm and edgy cute, right? Dangerous but warm and edgy cute. That joke, I think, kind of explains all kids' movies in some ways. You can see in The Country Bears a very careful balance. They want the bears to be cool outsiders, right? But let's stop short of the hard drugs. Okay, let's have it be kid-friendly. And I think this, in some ways, is a pretty decent representation of how a lot of mainstream popular culture at all levels, not just stuff for kids, how it works, how things are made marketable and acceptable and such, how there tends to be this balancing act. Sometimes maybe it does legitimately go, there's plenty of actually edgy bands out there that have made it big, right? But also this process of sort of dismantling this, co-opting, taking over these symbols and selling them is kind of a defining process of popular culture. Anyway, like I said, they stop short of the hard drugs, although one of the bears does seem addicted to honey, right? I'm not gonna. I feel like you probably get the point by now, but there's a gazillion examples in this movie where they're doing the balancing act, like, oh, let's have them do this thing that a cool edgy band would do, but let's replace this particular vice with something else. Let's have them do this instead of that, right? Interesting, very common, very common. Last thing on my mind is nostalgia. This is a backwards-looking movie, right? We have these interviews about how the Bears were. We've got scrapbooks. We've got legends of the Bears, right? So we're looking in the past, essentially. Even as the band is floating the idea of getting back together, it's all about what it was like, backwards-looking, all these things, right? So it's interesting that people are so nostalgic for this movie now. Of course, a huge part of that is just because they watched it as children, but you also wonder if maybe the fact that the film itself is kind of nostalgic has something to do with that. I don't know. I also think that bands breaking up is inherently kind of a nostalgic thing. Of course, people become emotionally invested in the music itself. It gets tied into a certain place and time in your life. But bands also, I think, can represent other things. They can represent relationships, as in maybe the dissolution of bands echoes the dissolution of your own relationships over time, periods of time when you're in a group, when you're together with people in a way that you can never come back. There's the old saying about, like, you can never cross the same river twice. I think in some ways a band that broke up kind of represents something like that as well. In certain periods of time, I've gone to a lot of shows in New York, and sometimes I've left feeling melancholy more than anything else, right? Sometimes you leave a show and you're like, wow, that was great. And you wonder, what am I doing with my life, right? Because the people on the stage, they can seem to be so much more real than, us. They aren't subject to any of these inevitabilities of life, the sacrifices of adulthood, the real life adult would you rather that you have to play most of the time in this world, right? Of course, being in a band has all kinds of drawbacks, I'm sure, but it represents something beautiful. Maybe we think of being in a band as the closest earthly thing to the music itself. Anyway, I don't want to pontificate much more, but I think the movie does a pretty good job of conjuring legend and tapping into this feeling of loss around a band that is no more. And it's interesting that this also echoes, in this case, a lifestyle that really is in direct contradiction with this suburban, like Barry's suburban life. And he goes and sets out on the road to do that. Now, then he says, oh, okay, I'm getting lonely, time to go back home or whatever. And the movie's very ambiguous with the end. They don't really mention, oh, so is Barry going to tour full time with the band in the future? Are they really getting back together? Are they not? Is he going to go back up? Like, not really clear where they leave things, but again, pretty interesting tension between the Country Bears and the suburb. Of course, this is a kid's movie, so don't expect too much emotional impact. But hey, overall, I think there are some interesting things in this movie. That's the Country Bears. These are just the things that jumped out at me when watching it. Let me know if you found anything else interesting in this movie. I'm sure there's a lot of other things to think about. And next week we'll be back with a film that is not made for children, hopefully. We'll see.